Alex Salmond joins me now. Are you going to win this?
Yes.
What makes you so confident?
Well, the nature of the campaigns, I think, more than anything else. I think there's two reasons. One is the nature of the campaign. We're fighting a totally positive campaign about the future of Scotland. The Labour campaign is not so much a Labour campaign, it's a non-SNP campaign or anti-SNP campaign. So the SNP are the focal point of the campaign. If that continues, we'll win the election. And secondly, I mean, I think there has been a considered judgment by people in Scotland after 8 years of devolution that they want something more, they want something better, they want something less disappointing than perhaps the executive has been over the last 8 years. That seems to me a pretty firm opinion, and I don't see it changing over the next 2 weeks.
Well, if you're right, people are going to have to make a judgment about you. You give up the leadership, head off to London, decide at the last minute you want it back again. I mean, what would you say to people who say, this guy just isn't a stable enough character to be the leader of a country? He might be an interesting chap, but not a leader.
Well, people seem to be making a reasonably favourable judgment. I mean, you showed a clip there when I launched my campaign to lead the SNP again and also to become First Minister of Scotland. That was just over 2 years ago, and I think a lot of people then were quite sceptical about whether or not the SNP could get into a challenging position. I think, whatever else you might say, we are now in a challenging position. So I think a lot of people are coming to a favourable judgment. But can I just say, I led the SNP for 10 years first time round. I mean, it's not exactly fly-by-night. 10 years was a considerable period. And I launched the campaign 2 years ago to lead the SNP again and become First Minister of Scotland.
If you do win this, you're not going to decide halfway through your term as First Minister that you're fed up with it and go do something else?
No, I'll serve as First Minister of Scotland, and more importantly, to try and take the country forward, to try and realise the ambitions we're setting out in this election campaign, which, let me say again, are totally positive, totally constructive, and all about the future of our country.
Right, now just hearing you repeat those buzzwords, positive and constructive, do you accept that in the past, at least, you were seen as too abrasive?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, I'm a kind of natural debater. I love debate. A lot of Scots are like that, actually. We're disputatious. So we like to win an argument, to make a point. I think what I've come to realise, maybe older and wiser, that sometimes by winning a point you can actually cloud the argument you're trying to make. And I'm so committed, absolutely committed, to this argument about a positive future for our country. I don't want anything I say or do to crowd out or to cloud out that particular argument. So I think if you're saying, look, this is more important than mere debate, this is about the future of the country, you must make sure that everything you do in your personal style doesn't deflect from the argument you're trying to get across. It's far, far too important for that.
Now, the Labour Party says the SNP in power would just be a recipe for endless strife with the government in London, at least until you manage to win your referendum on independence. It would be, wouldn't it?
No, I take exactly the opposite view. I mean, firstly, we're committed to success for Scotland. That's really important. But secondly, over and above wanting Scotland to do well, the SNP is an enormous political investment in the executive that we lead, building up credibility, building up trust with the people, because we want to win an independence referendum, a target date of 2010. I'll be at this point and then by all means come back in. The point is this: the way you build up trust and credibility is not by picking endless fights, it's by showing solid achievement, doing things for Scotland, making things happen. So we've got a huge political investment in making a success of the SNP
let's
executive.
take one issue. To get your local income tax plan to work, you need to get around about £400 million in council tax rebate.
380 million.
Yes, back from the government in London. You know perfectly well the Treasury won't give you that money. They wouldn't give the attendance allowance, the £25 million of that, to their own Labour colleagues when they brought in free personal care. So you know that you are proposing a policy which will inevitably simply lead to a fight with Westminster.
Well, let me just dispute the premise for a second. I mean, I know for a fact that the former First Minister, Henry McLeish, wanted to pursue that point and would have pursued it if he'd stayed in office. I also know that there was legal advice for Help the Aged, which said that what the Department of Work and Pensions were doing in that particular issue was wrong, but that fight was abandoned by the current executive. But the point I make, there were people in the Labour Party and elsewhere who wanted to make sure that Scotland's attendance allowance money wasn't swept back by the Department of Work and Pensions. So it was a bad idea to let that happen, because that's been one of the things, according to Stuart Sutherland, the father of free personal care, which has made the delivery of free personal care in Scotland totally inadequate. It's one of the reasons why people are on waiting lists around Scotland.
Sure, but the substantial point I'm making, as you know perfectly well, is that if they wouldn't give 25 million quid to their own colleagues, they're certainly not going to give someone they see as a political enemy 380 million.
Well, let me say why I think that's the wrong way to look at it. You see, I don't think it's in any way non-cooperative or being difficult to stand up for Scotland's interests, whether it's on attendance allowance or whether it's on the council tax rebate. We're quite entitled as an executive, as a government, to make a perfectly fair case that as long as things are of no cost to the Treasury or a London department, it's perfectly reasonable from within the devolved framework of Scotland either choosing to have free personal care or, for that matter, choosing to have a different system of local government finance. If that is not possible, then it means there is currently under devolution a London veto, not just on reserved issues, but on devolved issues as well. And I'm quite certain that the Treasury won't want to give that impression to the people of Scotland.
But surely you have just, in that answer you gave me, made in your new, terribly reasonable style, precisely the argument that your opponents make against you. Because what you've described is a situation which will inevitably cause conflict with London. And the point is, you know it. And if I can borrow a cliché from Annabel Goldie, the worry people have with you is that what they see, what they're going to get, is not quite what's written on the tin.
Gordon, I think I can disprove your point, finally and totally. The argument I've just given you is exactly the argument made by Nicholl Stephen on exactly the same point only yesterday on another programme. Now, Nicholl Stephen is an eminently reasonable man, and I think we can conclude if Nicholl says it and I say it, but perhaps even more if he says it, then it's an entirely reasonable, not unreasonable point of view.
Right, we'll discuss the I must be right because my new pal Nicholl is right in a moment. But do you have a plan B? If the Treasury were, horror of horrors, to say no, what do you do? Do you abandon your local income tax?
I've got plans from A to Z, Gordon. But,
but you're asking people to vote for this policy in an election. What is the plan B?
Well, the point is that we're going to succeed in making a perfectly reasonable request.
It's not given that it's not in your gift to decide this.
Yeah, but then
what's the plan B?
We put forward a perfectly reasonable case, and with every expectation we're going to be successful.
No, but that's the difference between you and Jack McConnell, isn't it?
No,
promises that Jack McConnell makes in his manifesto, it is within the power of the Scottish Executive to deliver. Promises that you make in your manifesto, it is not within the power of the Scottish Executive to deliver.
No, I think it's important that we have a government that stands up for Scotland, and that means standing up and making sure. I mean, this is not, incidentally, the London Treasury or the Department of Work and Pensions money. This is Scotland's money that they hold, the money contributed by Scotland's taxpayers. And it is totally incredible to argue that the London government will want to effectively attempt to undermine the democratic decision of the Scottish people to choose a different system and a much fairer system of local government finance. And therefore you go forward looking to win arguments, not to concede them before you even make the representations, which unfortunately I think you're probably right, the current executive would do.
What exactly are you going to ask the Treasury for with regard to oil revenues?
Well, I think there's a perfectly reasonable argument that we should be able to make a start on building up a fund for Scotland's natural resource after 40 years when there's been, or 35 years, when there's been no direct share coming to Scotland. I think it's quite reasonable to look for a start in building up an oil investment fund, as, for example, Norway or near neighbours of the East Coast have done.
Are you saying that if you win the election, you'll go and ask for what? Everything, all the oil revenues that you think should accrue to an independent Scotland?
No, I think that would wait till Scottish independence, Scotland. But I think we could make a start in building up an oil investment fund. Now, you say, is that an unreasonable position? That is actually the position that was once put forward by Edward Heath when he was the Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party. Strangely enough, it was turned down by the Tories in Scotland, but nonetheless it was floated by Willie Ross when he was the Secretary of State for Scotland in the 1970s. The Liberal Party once went into an election campaign pledging 50% of the revenues to Scotland. So putting forward that as a reasonable argument, again, is an issue of standing up for Scotland. And, of course, there's some considerable opinion poll evidence that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland thinks that's a perfectly reasonable position.